Have extra peaches? Want a sweet summer treat? Jams and jellies are easier than you think. I'm Marcy McDonald with Pacific Northwest Suburban Homesteading, and today I'm turning things over to remote Homestead Accomplice Shonna Zimmermann, who will show us jam making with her very own peaches.
Making jam and jelly doesn't have to be intimidating. Hi, I'm Shonna Zimmermann, and today I'm going to show you the techniques for this time-honored method of preserving fruit. Step 1, let's go get our fruit. I am very excited because this is the first year that my peach tree has put out a significant crop. I planted a dwarf variety called Frost a few years ago, and on the average, a peach tree takes 2 to 3 years to mature enough to be able to put out a crop, and this is my year. As I'm picking my peaches, I'm putting them in a wide basket rather than a bucket, simply because I don't want them piling up and weighing down on each other so much that they get crushed before I'm ready to use them. And today I'm going to use these lovely peaches that I just picked to make jam. The techniques I'm going to show you today will translate to pretty much any homemade jam or jelly that you want to make. However, your recipes can vary quite a bit. This is because the different fruits that can be used in jams and jellies have different natural levels of sugar or acid or even pectin in them. Today I chose a recipe for peach jam from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. I do recommend going to a reputable website like that or your local extension service to get a good recipe. In many cases, the supplier of the pectin that you use will put some basic recipes on their containers. For regular jams and jellies, the basic ingredients are going to be pretty much the same. You're going to need your fruit, prepared according to however the recipe requires it. You're going to need sugar, and you're going to need pectin. Some, but not all, jam and jelly recipes require lemon juice, and that's because the natural acid in your fruit is a little too low. And some jam and jelly recipes recommend a small amount of butter or margarine. That is an optional ingredient that is used to control the foam that could form during the cooking process. If foam is a problem that you have while you're cooking your jam or jelly, please feel free to use the butter to control it. That is not a problem that I have ever personally had to deal with. We're going to be making and canning the jelly at the same time, so I recommend preparing all of your equipment at once. For making your jam, you're simply going to need a pot to cook it in, something to stir, and of course something to chop your fruit up with. For the canning, you're going to need a separate pot or kettle for your boiling water bath canning. You're going to need your canning jars, and my personal recommendation is whatever the recipe says that you're going to need as far as jars, prepare 1 or 2 extra. Somehow I always wind up with a little more than what the recipe says, and it's better to have a jar prepared and not need it than the other way around. You're of course also going to need your 2-part canning lids with the bands and the lids, using modern good lids. And when I say use new modern canning lids, check this out. I just found this in my canning supplies. There's no year anywhere on this, but given that there's no mention of a website, the general colors of the package design, and the fact that you can send away for information including 35 cents for shipping and handling, makes me think that these are manufactured somewhere between 1986 and 1989. They're completely welded together. So when I say use new modern equipment, this is what I mean. And your basic canning equipment, such as your jar lifter, your lid magnet, your jar funnel. I'm only going to go over the very basics of water bath canning in this video. To get more information on that topic, please go to this channel's video, Water Bath Canning, and research it more carefully before you start. So as I'm prepping this fruit, I'm going to give you a couple tips for success. If your recipe says to chop or crush the fruit, that means chop with a knife and crush with a potato masher or something similar. Resist the temptation to use a food processor or a blender. Fruit that has been mechanically obliterated by one of those appliances just never tends to set up into proper jelly. You'll get a very soft, runny, syrupy product that is not what we're going for today. The next tip is do not double the batch. I know it can be tempting, especially if you have a particularly large batch of fruit that you want to make into jam or jelly. But the recipes that the pectin companies developed are very precise in the cooking times. If you were to double the batch, you've doubled the volume, but you may not necessarily need to double the cooking time. But with the double volume, suddenly you get uneven cooking. You may get a very rubbery texture. The sugar in your jam or jelly could caramelize. You could get a very grainy result. It is absolutely not advised to double a batch. As you're cooking your jelly, it is recommended that you use the widest pot that you can find. It is advised to have the shallowest batch and the widest amount of surface area for proper cooking. So the first thing we're going to do is give the fruit a good, quick wash. The first step is to prepare your fruit. The recipe I'm following calls for 3 3/4 cups of peeled, pitted, and crushed peaches. Pop quiz for everyone. What is the difference between jelly, jam, and fruit preserves?
Jelly is made with only fruit juice. It is a clear liquid that has been turned into a gel. And if you think about it, gel, jelly, gelatin, kind of all the same root word. It may have a little bit of cloudiness into it. There was a little bit of pulp that got through into the juice, but as you can see, there are no fruit chunks in it anywhere. Jam, on the other hand, has bits of fruit or seeds in it. When you spread it on toast, you can see that there are bits of fruit throughout it.
I like to think of it this way. It has little bits of fruits jam-packed into it. Little pieces, it's chunky, but not too chunky, because when you have larger chunks, then you're into what's called fruit preserve. The larger the chunks, the more likely it is considered fruit preserve. And then of course there's marmalade, which is citrus-based and has little bits of rind in it. I'm going to throw away the pits, but the peel is going to go very nicely into the compost pile.
So now that we've got about enough fruit, we just crush it lightly with a potato masher. We're not trying to turn it into a liquid. We still want chunks, but small chunks, because we're making jam, and as I said earlier, large chunks would mean we have preserves. Now, as you can see, 3 1/2 cups is about there. These did mash down quite a bit, so I'm going to need to chop up some more fruit and add it in.
So now that our fruit is prepared, we're almost ready to make our jelly. I recommend at this point that you measure out all of your ingredients ahead of time. First thing you're gonna do is put your prepared fruit in your pot. The recipe I'm using calls for 1/4 cup of lemon juice. And while the fruit is still cold, before you put it on the heat, you're going to put in your pectin. I like to use bulk pectin, but pectin does also come in individual packages. If you don't make a lot of jelly, maybe just 1 or 2 batches, that would be the way to go.
but since I make a lot, I use this. About 6 tablespoons of bulk pectin equals 1 package. We're gonna sprinkle that over the fruit. And then we're going to stir it in. And we're ready to put it on the stove where, as you can see, I've already got my boiling water canner ready to go. So now we turn the fruit on high and bring it very quickly to a full boil. I have 5 cups of sugar measured out already. We're not adding that until it comes to a boil, but it is good to have it handy because once you hit that boiling point, everything goes very quickly. I should probably have mentioned that if you were using the butter or margarine option, you would have added it at the same time as the pectin. As you can see, it's starting to boil a little bit, but we want a full rolling boil, which means hard bubbles all across the entire surface of the fruit. A full rolling boil is a boil that you can't stir down. As I give it a stir and the bubbles have disappeared, we have not yet reached the stage of full rolling boil. So we're almost to the stage of a full rolling boil. I'm going to break up some of the larger pieces of peach that didn't get crushed as well as I thought it did, but we're just about ready. All right, this is what you're looking for. The bubbles are not stirring down, so it is continuing to boil, and the bubbles are all across the whole surface. So when you've reached this point, you add all of your sugar all at once and stir it in. That will take the boil down, but you just leave it on the heat, on the high heat, and bring it back up to a boil. As you can see, it's starting to come back to a boil, but we have not quite reached the rolling boil stage that we want. There's also a little bit of foam forming on the top, but it's not that significant. Now we've reached the stage of the full rolling boil, and we're going to boil it hard for 1 minute. Keep it stirring so you don't scorch. 1 minute is up, so we're going to turn off the heat. I will probably skim a little of this foam off, but otherwise it's ready to can. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not going to go into details about boiling water bath canning. In essence, I have a pot of boiling water that I've got my pre-prepared, cleaned, and examined canning jars sitting in it. They're nice and hot because the last thing you want to do is put a very hot jelly into a cold jar, or even sometimes room temperature. Thermal shock can make them explode. Jelly goes into a jar filling up to about a 1/4 inch headspace. There are fancy little tools for measuring headspace. I don't have that, but I do know where a 1/4 inch is judged by the threads on the jar. So I'm going to go ahead and start filling these and processing them in the boiling water. Wiping the tops of the jars and the threads clean to make sure that there's no spills of jelly that will get in the way of forming a good seal. And now that the jars are filled and the rims have been cleaned, I'm going to apply the 2-part lids. Finger tightness only, and be aware that these are very hot, so don't grab them with your full hand. And once the lids are applied, into the boiling water they go. Now that those are in the canner, it's going to take just a minute to return to a full boil. When it does, I'm going to set the timer for 10 minutes, and that time will start down when it returns to that boil. Now, it is true that sometimes jelly doesn't set and it fails to congeal and stays as a syrupy liquid. If you give it about 10 minutes to cool down and look at the jelly that's left in your pot, you can tell very quickly whether it's going to set up or not. This is definitely going to be a good batch. 10 minutes are done, so I am going to turn off the heat and put the jars on a rack to cool.
Now I'm going to let these sit and cool to room temperature overnight, and we will check the lids to make sure that they sealed tomorrow morning. So the jars have had about 16 hours to cool down to room temperature, and at this point in jelly making, it's time to simply check the seals of your jars. Now, I know that there are a lot of ways that people may try to check the seal on their jar. As we mentioned in the Water Bath Canning 101 video, some people may try to push on it to see if it flexes. Some people may bop it with a spoon and listen for something. But really the best way is to take this band off and just give it a slight lift or a slight tug with fingertip strength only. If your jar has sealed, that lid is going to stay in place. Real quick and easy test, you want to do it for each one of them. Now, the reason I said 16 hours instead of 24 hours is because sometimes your jar might not seal. Oh no, just like this. Don't panic if one of your jars didn't seal. As long as you discovered it within the first 24 hours of canning, you have options. I would like to point out that the 24 hours is because this has been sitting on your counter unrefrigerated. It is entirely about food safety at that point. But if you have discovered it within 24 hours, which is why I checked this at the 16-hour mark, I have certain things I can do to save this. First of all, my favorite option, if I just have one jar that didn't seal, is to eat it. You put a lot of work into this jelly. You deserve a treat. But if you want to keep this for a while and you're not ready to eat it right now, jelly does freeze very well. Put it in a freezer-safe container with more headspace than you have given in the canning jar. When jelly freezes, it expands quite a bit, and a 1/4 inch of headspace is not going to be enough. It will burst through the freezer container. But once you've put it in a freezer-safe container, it will keep for up to a year. But if you want a sealed jar, say for instance you're making these for your favorite gift-giving holiday, jelly is a sturdy enough product that you can actually reprocess it. You're going to take it out of the jars and reheat it just like you're cooking the jam with the fruit and the pectin, but you're not going to boil it hard for that 1 minute. You're just going to heat it up to that boiling point. In the meantime, you're going to clean and inspect your jars, make sure that it didn't seal because was there a chip in the rim perhaps? Once those are clean, you're going to fill them just as you did the first time. You're going to put on new lids. I don't recommend reusing the lid because you don't know why that one failed. It's also been through a boiling water bath. You just want to use a new one. They're really inexpensive. Boil it in the canner for another 10 minutes as usual. Take it out and let it cool for 16 hours, just as I showed you, and test the seal again. If it has failed another time, I don't recommend reprocessing the jelly a third time. I recommend getting creative with it and maybe making a jelly roll. All right, so it's been a little more than 24 hours, and now is the time to check to make sure that your jam or jelly has set up. The easiest way to do that is just to pick up a jar and tip it slightly. Do you see it sloshing around in there? No? Looks pretty firm. That's a good, well-set jar of jelly. But occasionally, for whatever reason, it doesn't set up. And it's pretty obvious when it happens. This is a batch of bell pepper jelly I made a few weeks ago. It never did set up. I don't know why, but as you tip it, you can see it's just sloshing around in there. But don't worry, even if your jelly didn't set up, you still have options. But before you exercise any of those options to try to fix a runny jelly,
The first thing I want you to do is wait. Give it another 24 hours. Give it 48 hours. Jams don't all set at the same rate. I've been told by some people that it took an entire week for their jam and jelly to set up. So give it time and be patient. But if 2 weeks have gone by and your product is still swooshing around in the jar, time to move on to the next step. There can be a lot of reasons that your jelly didn't set. Maybe you didn't boil it long enough. Maybe you didn't add enough sugar, even though you thought you followed the recipe exactly. You do have the opportunity to try to recook it. For every 4 cups of soft jelly that you're trying to remake, put it in a saucepan, put in a 1/4 cup of sugar and a tablespoon of pectin, bring it back to a hard boil, and make sure you boil it at least 1 minute, but possibly up to 5 if you're trying to boil it down if it's too runny. Make sure that you don't burn it, but when it is a very thick and syrupy consistency, proceed with water bath canning as per instructions. If you're not necessarily interested in going through the water bath canning process again, another thing you can experiment with to save your too soft jelly is freezer pectin. This is a product that you would put into the soft jelly and heat it up, bringing it to a boil, but then you would just put it in a refrigerator or freezer safe container, put it in the fridge, and let it do its thing that way. It usually results in a slightly softer jam or jelly, but it's a great option, especially if you're going to use that jam right away. But honestly, I think the best way to save any jam or jelly that didn't set up is to practice the noble art of, I meant to do that. Now, let's say this peach jam didn't set up. I'm not going to tell people that. I'm going to invite all my friends over for Sunday brunch with fresh homemade peach compote for our Belgian waffles, or maybe peach topping for our yogurt parfaits. Get creative with it. You meant to do that. What am I going to do with this bell pepper jelly that never set up? Well, I think I'm going to stir in a little rice wine vinegar and make the best sweet and sour sauce you've ever had. I meant to do that, and it came off perfectly. So congratulations on your batch of jam or jelly. Don't forget to label it with the date and contents and store it in a cool, dry place for up to 1 year.
A special thank you to Shonna Zimmermann for recording and sending me this video. Thanks for watching. Until next time, be curious, keep an open mind, and never stop learning.